Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here and welcome to this debate moderated by Arabiya. This is being streamed live on our English website, english.alarabiya.net. We are discussing today the challenges of growth and unemployment in the region. To put things into context, 75 million jobs are required in the Arab world in the next decade. This translates to 20,000 jobs per day required in a region which already has one of the highest unemployment rate among its youth. How high are the growth rates, and do they accommodate the new job seekers? And how do the risks in the global economy reflect on the region? Let me introduce you to our panel. We have Mr. Masood Ahmed, Director, Middle East and Central Asia Department at the IMF, Dr. Erik Berglöf, Chief Economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, Dr. Mustafa Nabli, Economist and former Governor of the Central Bank of Tunisia. We have Curt Rhodes, Founder and International Director, Questscope, and Habib Haddad, Chief Executive Officer of Wamda. I would like to mention that the floor would be open for some questions from the audience during this session. Let me start with you, Mr. Masood. In the latest report of the IMF, you have mentioned, or you have forecasted, that the global economy will grow by 3.3% in 2012 and 3.6% in 2013. However, these forecasts are based on two major assumptions. The first one is that the economic situation in Europe is much better, and the second one, the United States will avoid the fiscal cliff. How confident are you that these risks will be avoided, and what will happen if one of these assumptions fail?
The forecasts that the IMF has come up with, which are the numbers that you cited, are basically a weak and uneven recovery. If you look at Europe, in fact, what we are looking ahead is Europe contracting this year. If you look at the United States, it's 1.5% growth. And even these numbers are subject to there being early action, both in Europe to address the challenges of the Eurozone we all know about, and in the US to deal with the fiscal cliff. And if you come to the region, you find that the aggregate numbers for the region, which first glance look good, you go behind them and you discover that the numbers for the countries which are the oil exporters are indeed good, but the numbers for the oil importing countries are very anemic. Maybe 2% growth, between 2 and 3 if they do well, which is nothing like the number they need to deal with their rising unemployment.
But however, for the oil exporters, you are still forecasting a growth rate of 3.8%. That's the lowest since 2009. Are the risks here only in the volatility of oil prices that may be caused by the reasons we just mentioned?
I think for oil exporters, the headline numbers on growth are always a little bit difficult to read because they have the oil economy and the non-oil economy. And the oil economy in these countries, if you need to produce more oil, the number goes up or it goes down. What really matters is what is happening to the non-oil part of these economies. And there you have fairly healthy 5-6% growth rates. So in the oil exporters, I don't think that the problem is growth per se. The problem there is to find the right skills match to be able to find jobs for nationals in the private sector rather than to employ them consistently year after year in the public sector.
We will go back to this issue, but I want to move to Dr. Erik. Dr. Erik, if we look at the Arab Spring countries, the situation is much different there. We are still talking about more or less a political instability, slow recovery in tourism and FDIs, and still wide budget deficits, and governments unwilling to take any measures, unpopular measures, to gap these deficits. From the perspective of an international lender, are you satisfied with what the governments have done already?
Well, I think one should be very open about the problems that these countries are facing. I mean, they're going through fundamental political transition, and it's not so easy to solve all those things overnight. And it's clear that it's affecting investment. It's affecting also the confidence overall in the ability of governments to handle situations. So both domestic investors and foreign investors, they sit and wait. And that's very much what I think we see in the region now. of course, also these fundamental reforms that are needed to address the problem of the business environment are not being implemented. So we are pushing the problem ahead of us. And really to address the problem of unemployment, you need to address the problem of the business environment.
But do you think that these reforms have slowed down? Is it because of the situation, the political instability, or they might take more time since new regimes have, we have seen more conservative regimes in these Arab Spring countries?
Well, first of all, I think one should look back at the reforms that were undertaken, and they were not always probably the right reforms. I mean, I think the ambition was often the right one, but the way it worked out, was not necessarily, certainly in the sense of inclusion, in the sense of the broad population feeling that they were benefiting from the reforms. I think that was not in place. So I think there was a need to rethink how these reforms were being implemented in the region. And then, as I said, you are facing very fundamental political challenges. It's not so easy to also push ahead this agenda, which is very complex and requires a very broad range of measures. So I think we should have a bit of patience with these countries. It doesn't mean that the problem will not go away for sure, but we need to give them some time to respond.
I want your opinion, Dr. Mustafa, on this issue. Tunisia was the ground zero of the Arab Spring. Bouazizi was the start of the revolution, and unemployed Bouazizi. However, 2 years after the revolution, we are still talking about unemployment rates that are at record high of 18%. So still, are you satisfied with what has been done by your government?
That's a good question. I think we have to. I think there was in 2011. It was clear that we were through a real paradox. That one of the causes of the revolution, whether it's in Egypt and Tunisia and so on, was the unemployment and the youth unemployment and the educated unemployed and so on. But the paradox is that during 2011 things worsened. In Tunisia, unemployment was 13% before it became 18%. So things got worse. And this comes what I call the iron law of transition. Things are bound to get worse, much worse before they get any better. So we are in the situation where we are at the stage where we are in the much worse situation. So we cannot be pleased with that. That's no doubt we cannot be pleased with that. Now, the issue is that the recovery, how quick and how fast the recovery is going to be. And what we are seeing that this recovery is not at any satisfactory level. By any measure, growth rates of 2 or 3% or 3.5% after a decline or a very low growth rate in 2011 is bad. It's not a success. And we have to keep in mind that this is really driven by two factors. One is internal and one is external. The external, we know, it's Europe. It's the crisis in Europe, and it has negative impact on the countries of the region, which are highly connected to the European economy. But I think the more important one is the domestic one. And I think the real reason for that is the failure of the political process. The political processes in the countries have not been successful and have not been, I wouldn't say smooth enough, because revolutions can never be smooth enough. They have not been well managed, sufficiently well managed to provide perspective, to reduce uncertainty, to reduce, turmoil. Has been a lot of noise, lack of visibility, a lot of, unrest and so on, which has hurt the investment climate, hurt investment. So investment and so is really at standstill, domestic and foreign. And so the economy is not recovering. It's really having a very difficult time recovering in any reasonable way.
So what are the priorities then? Which measures should be taken
so
we can see quick results?
It follows from what I said. The first thing to do is to have a clear, roadmap, political roadmap. We are failing to see in Tunisia to say it's big failure is that, and there is no reason to it. I mean, if you, by any rational person, there is no reason in Tunisia that we cannot have a clear roadmap, political roadmap. clear date for the end of constitution, clear date for the next of elections, clear date of the institutions that are going to be put in place to have the elections. All of these things should be easy to put, but there is a lack of will at the political level, and there is a lot of mistrust at the political level, which is hindering this. So the first action to me is really get the act together at the political level.
I shall move to you now, Mr. Rhodes. We were talking about the unemployment rate among the youth. This region, like 60% of the population is below the age of 25. However, it has, as I said, one of the highest unemployment rates worldwide, 26%. You yourself, you manage an NGO that deals with the less fortunate youth. What are the implications of this youth unemployment from a social and economic point of view?
Well, the implications will be a lot of alienation, lack of hope, and if young people can't find themselves in the picture that we've created for them, someone will create a picture for them to be part of. So it has great social consequences for us.
And economic point of view, like when the youth is unemployed, what does this imply to the productivity of the country?
Well, you're first talking about the loss of the human resource capacity of a country. Either our youth are our biggest asset, or they become a big liability. You also talk about on an individual basis, how will a young man or a young woman go beyond being a dependent child? How will they gain the self-respect that you need if you cannot generate your own life? And that greatly depends upon your income earning potential. That hinges on the preparation that you get for earning that income. And that's a lot of the area that we work in, is preparing young people who, in a sense, missed their chance for the basic education that will prepare them for the economy that is coming.
Habib, we were talking about the business environment. You, of course, you're the CEO of Wamda. You deal with entrepreneurship. I want to ask you that the latest report by the World Bank has identified that the political or the reforms are slowing down after the Arab Spring. Do you agree with that?
I mean, first, let me just tell you that the story of entrepreneurship in the Arab world is a story of hope and optimism, and I don't want the audience or anyone else to be depressed by what we've been hearing so far. Yes, the political reforms are slowing down, but you know what? The bottom-up world doesn't really care that much. I'm going to tell you a few concrete problems that we have not been seeing any reforms in. For example, the borders are still very high. There's still a high friction of startups to scale, and that's a big problem. Today, to solve unemployment, entrepreneurship is key, but entrepreneurship not just key and dot. I think a lot of the Arab world and the governments are just using entrepreneurship as a check mark. It's sexy, it's cool, and it calls to the youth, but it's not really being solved the right way. The right way of solving entrepreneurship is bringing down the barriers, allowing startups to scale. Because startups at a 5, 10 employee level doesn't help. We need them to scale to the hundreds. I think we have the role of government here, but not just the role of government, the role of private sector. The private sector already in the Middle East is multi-regional. Let's take a few concrete examples. Aramex is one of the regional companies that's doing a good story here. Aramex is a logistics company, exists in all the Arab world, and offering its services and its access to clients to young companies who come to Aramex and offer solutions to its clients, mainly in the e-commerce space. So we are seeing some solutions. The S is small in solutions. I think we need to amplify those. We need to have a big ass solutions. So I think, again, bring down the barriers, access to capital. We still have a lot of problems. We've been trying to invest in a startup in Tunis for the past year, and they need an okay from the central bank. Why can't we invest? Why is it hard for a company to start in Saudi Arabia? You were going to ask me about, because we talked a bit before on the call, and you said we're going to ask me about the ease of doing business. Well, let's not tap ourselves on our back. We're not in high school here. We're not fighting for grades. We actually want results. We want concrete results. In Saudi Arabia, it's super hard for someone to get a tourist visa, let alone a business visa. In the UAE...
Those Saudi Arabia regs first in the Arab world when it comes to the ease of doing business.
Yeah, and I'm not sure, how much I would really trust that. We invest in startups. It takes them forever to start a business in Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, mind you, is the biggest market, is the prize, is the golden trophy for every single startup, and every single SME. So Saudi Arabia needs to open up its borders, needs to allow the Arab world to be called Arab world. I don't want to call the Arab world MENA and have 22 different borders and countries. Why can't we call it Arab world and have 350 million access to 350 million consumers versus saying it's all those countries? So again, we have huge, amazing fundamentals in the Arab world, youth and internet penetration, technology, and all of that. But why are we putting borders? And why is the private sector also obsessed about protecting its assets versus maximizing its upside? It's really, there's a protectionism feeling here about the private sector. But that said, what I said before is there are solutions. It's a small s. We need them to make them big s.
Of course, we're going to go back to many of the points that you've just mentioned, but I would like to open the floor now for some questions from the audience. Please introduce yourself and raise your hand so we can pass the microphone. Any questions? There's Dr. Nasser Saidi. Please, can you start?
Okay.
Just
Thank
1
you.
second, doctor.
Thank you very much.
You're the second.
Thank you very much. My name is Dan Rundy. I'm at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in the United States. I work on international development issues. I wanted to ask what the role of institutions like the World Bank, the EBRD, the IMF, and bilateral donor agencies, whether it's USAID or European aid agencies. I'd love to hear from the panel your perspectives on what you need now from various partners who want to be helpful.
Who would like to answer that? Dr. Erik?
Well, I think the first thing has been for us, of course, to be allowed to invest in this part of the world, and that's only a month now we have been allowed to do this, and we are very much new here, and for us, it's a very exciting opportunity, and we do really sense the urgency. What we need is, we need to get support from governments, in the sense, a commitment to reforms. We invest in individual companies, and we know, we understand that we need to be part of changing the broader environment, but we need a commitment that this is going to be high on the priorities, and I think at the moment we really don't have that, unfortunately.
Mr. Masood, you wanted to add something.
I want to add just one thing, which is, I think all the international agencies, World Bank, OECD, etc., can help on a regular basis to provide experience of other countries, technical support, and sometimes financing to support initiatives. But I think we need to focus on the fact that right now, particularly in the countries that are going through transition, we are running out of time because over the last year, in every single country, unemployment has increased. In Egypt, last year, there were 750,000 young people that came to join the labor force, and probably 200,000 jobs created. So there's 500,000 new people waiting for jobs. And frankly, over the next year, one of the roles that the international agency, particularly the IMF, has, is to help those countries to provide them with financing and support for a program that would ensure macroeconomic stability while they deal with this social challenge. Because if you have macro instability in the middle of all of these transitions, that would make things much, much worse. So I would like to say that the problem is urgent. There's a chronic issue of unemployment in the region, but there's also an urgent, acute problem that we need to address as almost like a regional, national emergency. This is the employment challenge that we have to step up to, and I'm worried that sometimes I see that the things that are being done are very successful, but they're small and need to be scaled up quickly.
Dr. Erik, you wanted
just
to say something.
Show the link between what Masood is talking about and what I was talking about. We need a macro stability, because what we see now in many of the countries is that interest rates are sky high, banks engage in lending to governments instead of lending to small and medium-sized enterprises, where the jobs can be created. So you need both. You need a macro stability, but you also then need a commitment to business environment.
We will go back to the point of the competitiveness of the private sector. But first, I want to take the question from Dr. Nasser Saidi.
Thank you. Clearly, and you pointed to it, job creation is the clear priority. And Masood, of course, pointed to the fact that we're talking about two types of unemployment. There's chronic unemployment. Let's remember that the average rate of unemployment has been well in excess of 15% across the region, not for 1 year or 2 years, but something like 10 to 15 years, or as long as we have the numbers. Now, add to that the Arab Spring effect. What it points to is that you also need structural reforms, and I'd like to hear what sort of structural reforms should be put in place to address chronic unemployment. The other comment, I think, which is important, is the issue of what have governments done over the past 2 years. And if you look at what governments have done, they've increased spending. In many cases, they've raised wages in the public sector.
Exactly.
They've raised benefits. They've increased subsidies. All of that goes in the wrong direction. What you need to do, as was pointed out by Habib, is that you need to focus on the private sector. That's where the job creation is going to be happening. The family-owned businesses, the SMEs. And yet, that is neglected, is not being given the importance. We've increased current spending, most likely on an unsustainable basis. It's affecting even fiscal stability in the GCC countries, which are enormously rich. So what I'd like to hear is, what are the government policies? What are the structural reforms that are important? And just a side issue on the cost of doing business report by the World Bank. That has become really a box-ticking exercise. And it's not clear that these are really meaningful. When you go out and say that it's easier to do business in Saudi Arabia to somebody living in Dubai, I mean, everybody will just laugh. It's so much easier to do business in Dubai, establish yourself as a young person, than in Saudi Arabia. And it's not just visas, it's across the board. So there's something wrong with those indicators themselves. So I don't think we should focus too much on them. But I'd like to hear what the panel has to say about what sort of structural reforms, labor market, greater flexibility, and one other item which I think deserves a great deal of attention, women and women empowerment. The labor force participation rate of women in our region is half of what it ought to be. We're running around 26%. So the unemployment numbers and the job creation numbers are based on the fact that women stay only at 26%. So if women are supposed to participate at 50%, which is what the average ought to be, then the unemployment numbers and job creation nearly doubles.
Okay, so let me start from this last point, because you have mentioned several points, and I want Dr. Nabli to answer this one. The women participation in Tunisia, what should be done?
I think it's well known now. It has been well known for a long time. I think for at least 10 years we have looked at this problem about women empowerment in the labor markets. And this region overall is really the worst performer of all. The participation rate of women is of the order of 25%, more or less. It's more than 25 for some country, less than 25. Tunisia is in the average. So contrary to what is usually thought, Tunisia is not doing any better than the average of the Arab countries on that matter. While the gains of women have been strong in other areas, in family law, in personal freedoms, and so on, it has not been the case which means that what is holding back women entering the labor market are deep-rooted issues. They are structural, social issues. And I think they're not easy to deal with. And especially in an environment where there is a lack of jobs. So we have seen in periods where the economy is growing and is doing well, the labor force participation of women goes up. When the economy goes down, the labor force participation goes down, which means that women are playing a role of buffer in the labor market in some way. They are the first to go out if things go bad, and they go in if things get better. So the first thing to do for women empowerment is for a healthy job market to start with, for everybody. And second, to deal with the deep-rooted structural issues. We have to deal with transportation, about care for children. You develop the facilities for care for children because this helps women, go to work and so on. So there are a number of specific issues that you have to deal with that are related to that subject.
I want to hear the opinion of Habib on this matter. How can you describe the role of women in entrepreneurship in the last few years?
So I think women in entrepreneurship, something is growing. We're seeing it as a growing phenomenon. And we've invested in Wamda, we've invested in 2 startups that are run by women. And let me tell you, they're much better than men. I think what we need, though, is more role models. A guy by the name of Roger Bannister ran a 4-minute mile in the 60s, I think. And after, it was a breaking record, and everyone was so impressed by it that a few months after, there was a number of athletes who actually broke that record. Just to tell you of how big is the role of role models. So role models, the press has to talk a lot more about the women on entrepreneurship, talk about them, spotlight them. I'm not sure about the quotas and that approach and how useful that is. I think we need to definitely go through the meritocracy approach. But what we're seeing today in entrepreneurship, and I think the private sector has taken it as something we need to do, is support the women. So again, women in entrepreneurship. Number 2 is education. And I was reading a report by Booz that says that 60% of the youth in the GCC think that women belong at home. Okay, so
wow.
So that's a huge number. So I think education, we need to educate our youth a bit more and tell them that they belong in the World Task Force and they can do a better job than you. And again, it plays back to the role of role models, I think. Role models is, to me, a big, important piece. And because it's a short-term and a long-term solution. You can do a lot by quickly spotlighting the success stories and showing to others that it can be done.
We might go back to the topic of women if we have time, but I want to move to you, Mr. Masood. And what Dr. Nasser was talking about is the competitiveness of the private sector. We have seen governments in the GCC, like he said, raising salaries, and this has pushed nationals to work in the public sector because of the better salaries, the better hours, and the better benefits. Just yesterday, we heard the Sultan of Oman asking the private sector, asking the citizens to seek jobs in the private sector before going to the public sector, and also urged the private sector to increase the minimum wage. Do you think that this is negatively affecting the job market, these measures?
If you look at the GCC countries, because I think it's quite different for the GCC countries compared to the emerging markets or oil importers. Certainly the case that high salaries in the public sector raise the reservation wage, particularly of nationals, and make it harder for the private sector to recruit nationals. What happens then, of course, is that you do get a lot of expatriates who come into the private sector. So you have a pattern developing in many countries where the nationals are working mainly in the public sector and the expatriates are working mainly in the private sector. Now, there are some programs in many countries, in Oman, that you mentioned, but also in Saudi Arabia, elsewhere, to try and get more nationals to be employed in the private sector. But to do that, beyond wages, there's the issue of looking at what kind of skill set nationals have, and whether or not they're the right skill set for the kinds of jobs that are emerging. So there's a package of things that I think will need to be done, but within that package, certainly the higher the wages in the private sector, the harder it is for the comparable private sector firm to do that.
Mr. Rhodes, let me move to you. A major problem, probably for youth unemployment, is education and the mismatch between what is taught at school and what is required by the private sector. How can we fix that?
If I could fix that, I could win the Nobel Prize, okay? So I'll give a suggestion or two. We have a bipodal distribution of this need that you're talking about for better skills. You have basic skills, basic education, and then you have those people who are educated at university level. In Jordan, your greatest risk factor for not being employed is to have a university degree. So you may have a
not
good...
only in Jordan,
not only
among
in
the
Jordan.
region, I guess.
So let me move down to the level of those people who will be fixing our cars and fixing our plumbing and fixing our air conditioners. These are the technicians that make our society work. In the circumstance that I've been in with the Ministry of Education in Jordan, we have a very high level of dropouts from basic education. So if you don't finish 10th grade, what can you do? That's the doorway to your future. So it's, I like what you said, that it's okay to have a good idea, but you need a good idea for 100,000 people. You need to be able to scale this up. So in a cooperation with the Ministry of Education and our organization, Questscope, we designed an alternative education pathway, which we know in the West is the General Education Equivalence Diploma. And this allows us to work on literacy issues, but also issues of critical thinking, and allow young people who have dropped out of school to get back to 10th grade. Then the Ministry of Education changed their policy and allow those 10th grade holders to go back to the formal system or to continue in vocational training. But the key here is that by adding the critical thinking component and by getting the policy change so that if you start on a pathway, you can be mainstreamed. This has created quite a change for up till now about 7,000 young people. And we have our eye on the 100,000, which is going to be possible. There are other initiatives that deal with university graduates or those in between. One that's quite effective in the Middle East is education for employment, where you actually take young people who received an education, but they need what sometimes people call soft skills, or as we were talking earlier, after you've had your first job, then you're ready for a job, right? I remember my first job. So I learned how to get my first job by getting my first job. So education for employment is a mechanism for helping young people who are university graduates or have graduated from high school acclimate themselves to employment. There's another initiative that's part of the WF Global Council for Youth Unemployment called 10, which is a nicely branded program now that asks companies to hire 10 young people and be strategic about that hiring, to bring them into the company, not just as employees, but employees who are slightly different. You wouldn't have hired them otherwise, and they bring a new set of energy and insight to your corporation.
Okay.
So there are a lot of options. We have almost as many options as we have problems. It just requires thinking it through carefully and making sure that it can scale up.
Okay, so we'll take now another question from the floor. Please, pass the mic.
Thank you very much. George Foster from Stanford University. I've had several discussions with private sector people who have faced major changes in government. So like in Libya, in Egypt, where the private sector was almost forced to have relationships with one part of the government, then there's a major shift in the government, and there's a significant backlash about some of those companies. How would you advise the private sector companies to sort of balance the potential change in government with the backlash that may happen if it switches right to the other side? And we see potentially this happening in Syria at the moment too.
Who would like to answer that? Go ahead.
I think this is a very nice issue and question. Actually, it leads to what we have been discussing in the Global Agenda Council on the Arab world. It's exactly that issue that we are trying to tackle in terms of the private sector and the need for the private sector to undergo a major transformation to go from the old private sector, which was kind of living connected to the government, embedded with the government, and private sector which was living on rents and so on, to a private sector which is more competitive, based on merit, based on broad-based access to entrepreneurship, to businesses, and so on. So this is a major issue, and that's the issue that the Global Agenda Council is trying to kind of work on over the next couple of years. Because the question you're asking is a very difficult one. It's a very difficult one because you have, like in Libya, you have a situation where there have been hundreds of contracts which have been awarded to companies from Europe, from everywhere, from any country that you, and almost all of these contracts are corruption ridden. There has been some kind of corruption. And the new government is trying to say, okay, let's see. Let's make sure that we are not going to continue with companies which have signed contracts with the government, and they have been subject to corruption. So they're trying to look at ways to resolve those issues. And so there is no problem, there is no surprise that these companies are having a difficult time, having a clear and smooth relationship with the new government. And that is part of the problem that these countries are facing, because these companies which used to play by some rules don't know what are the new rules yet. So they're waiting. Everybody is waiting, and we are getting into this waiting game, and that's what explains the slowness of recovery. So the sooner the governments clarify the rules, and that's why I was emphasizing the importance of the completion or of progress on the political process, because if you quicken the political process, you know what are the rules of the game at the political level. Therefore, the governments that are going to come are the governments that are going to be based on elections, based on new political program and so on. Then they need to clarify the rules of the game. It's not only business climate, like Dr. Saidi was, business climate, ticking the boxes of this and that. It's really the way doing business, the way to do business in those countries have to change dramatically. And this is important. So that's why the political dimension is so important. And the political dimension, part of it is once it works itself out, it has to clarify the relationship between business and politics.
Dr.
And this is business in politics is really at the heart of the political transformation as well.
Dr. Erik had a point to add.
Well, I think what Dr. Mustafa is talking about is absolutely essential. We have seen this working in Eastern Europe, the rise of oligarchy and the capture of the political process. What we need is a new small and medium-sized business a group of interest that pushes that agenda, that enforces competition policy, that takes away entry barriers, that improves access to finance. All those things have not been part of the agenda of these large connected companies. So it's a whole new approach to building your industry.
I want to go back to the topic of education, because really I want to discuss something that I've read in a recent report by Booz. They said that one of the solutions can be shouldn't come from the public sector only. We should see more involvement from the big corporations, especially family-owned or semi-government corporations, in a way that we have seen in Saudi Arabia. Some of these companies, they have established training institutes. We have the Mitsubishi Lift Institute, for example, in Saudi Arabia, the Plastic Institute, and they can train the graduates for some specific skills. Do you agree on that matter? I want to ask Mr. Masood first.
Well, I'm not an expert on those particular institutes, but I think if you look at the concept, sure, why not? Because if you look at the fact that, in fact, a lot of the training so far has largely come from the public sector, and that training hasn't yet generated enough of the right skills. And then we were talking about education for employment. Well, one of the elements of that is actually to get the employers more involved in the design of the curriculum and the training process. Now, exactly how you do it is something you need to work out. But the concept of getting the private sector and potential employers more involved in designing the curriculum, I think is a good idea.
Habib, what do you think about that? I want to ask you, with your experience with the entrepreneurs, how many do you think really acquired their skills from university? Since we're talking about like 5 universities, they teach entrepreneurship in the region?
Probably none, and that's not just in the Middle East, it's everywhere in the world. But actually, on the point that of hedging transitional risks, I think one of the ways is for private sector to invest in its people. If you're a consumer brand and your clients are the people, one of the solutions would be to invest in your people. Investing in your people means sometimes skills, educational trainings. It could also be entrepreneurship programs, I'm going to hire someone to come to my company, spend a year there, figure out the problems that my clients have, go out, and when they go out and leave, I'm not just going to kick them out the door. I'm going to say, great, go open your company, and I will be your client, and you will be my client. So there's a lot that could be done here if we bring down protectionism, if the private sector starts thinking, well, you know what, I'm not going to compete with the small guy. The small guy is my friend. And the word SME in general is somewhat of a negative word, just because when you say SME, it doesn't encourage you to grow, you want to stagnate. So I think this is one issue as well, that the family business in the Middle East kind of are living in a status quo because of their connections. And this is where when you open the market, when you break down monopolies, then you're going to see more competition happening there. But again, I think the private sector needs to invest more in its people, training, entrepreneurship, and most importantly is working with startups. Another thing that companies are doing are investing. You have corporate venture arms. In the Middle East, I only know of a handful of examples, but Intel Capital, Google Ventures are great examples of investment arms of companies that have created billions of dollars of companies. In the US, every 2 months now, you have $1 billion company being born. In the Middle East, I don't know if there are any that we can count, basically a handful of them. So again, it's always about scaling, and the private sector has the access and the channels to all of those markets to make it happen.
How about the role that the European Bank is playing here in financing the SMEs?
Well, I think we can do that in many different ways. I mean, one way is to take what's there already, the banks, and get the banks to think about how they can develop the SME business. We saw in Eastern Europe exactly the same pattern we see, for example, in Egypt today. The banks were primarily funding government. It took them almost a decade to move to funding SMEs, but now it's the most profitable business for them. So I think it's a whole mindset. Then we can work, of course, also investing, as we have done now recently, in private equity funds. We ask others to identify firms and manage and govern those firms. I think that's a very effective way for us to address this SME. But again, it's about not only investing in individual firms and investing in or providing credit lines to banks. It's also about changing the environment, to getting new companies born and exiting companies that are not efficient.
I'm going to take one last question from the audience.
Hi, my name is Ibrahim Tadros. I'm a global shaper from the Dubai Hub. And my question is, we have a phenomenon in the Middle East that happens quite a lot. And it leads to a lot of frustration and low productivity, the phenomenon of nepotism or wasta. How do we change our culture towards wasta? How do we start employing the right people for the right jobs, whether public or private sectors, both? And how do we make sure that the frustration doesn't build up for the actually good, educated employees that are trying to find jobs and don't find them because of this phenomenon?
Who would like to answer that? Dr. Mustafa, you are the head.
It's a very difficult one. I think one of the reasons of the revolution, I think when you go back and look, I mean, in Tunisia, at least where it started, one of the reasons of the motivations of the youth which went out on the streets and is this issue about, for instance, access to jobs, nepotism in access for jobs. So if such a company or such a place is opening kind of recruitment, and therefore when you look who has got the jobs at the end of the game, you find that it's people who are connected to the political party, to government, to the ministers, and so on and so on. So it's one of the major problems. Now, the problem is that after the revolution, it does not seem that this problem is improving. It's my iron law again. It gets worse, and before it, hopefully, it gets better. Because nepotism is taking new forms in addition to the old forms. For instance, now people talk about getting quotas in terms of jobs for such a region, for such a group, for the unemployed, for instance. You start having jobs for the guys who have been the longest unemployed. You give them priority. It's not merit, it's the length they have been employed, which is really opposite to merit and to what the firm is looking at. So, and then when you have, sometimes we have in Tunisia, it's really a major problem. It's not an easy one. You have some recruitment, and then you announce the guys who have won, gave criteria, everything, and then when you open and see, you have a riot, okay? People don't like it, because those who didn't get the jobs feel they have been cheated anyway. Because it's ingrained, they think that somebody must have done something wrong, because they don't believe that this thing has been done properly. So overcoming this is extremely important. But the solution, coming to the solution, is coming back to the same issue about the private sector. It's really, we have to change the mindset. We have to see that the rules of the game are really clear and are enforced. And once people see that they're enforced, the first time, the second time, the third time, and so on, then mindsets will change and people will learn to live with it. So that I give you just one anecdote. You know, in the central bank. In the central bank,
I want to tackle one more issue because our time is almost up. I want to address Mr. Rhodes now on the issue of because you deal with the youth, and we have heard that it's in the culture, it's in the Arab culture that they would associate failure with shame. They won't take any risk because it's shameful for them. Do you still think that this applies to the youth?
I never thought that applied. When I went to Jordan 22 years ago, everyone told me no Jordanian will be a waiter in a restaurant. If you go to Amman today, all waiters in the restaurant are Jordanians. Why? Once you have an educational pathway that prepares you to be a good waiter, and you have a career path that moves you ahead in the restaurant business, and you have the respect, the uniform, the status of a waiter, then who wouldn't want to be a waiter? So all of this talk that Arabs will not take risks and Arab youth will not do certain jobs, I'm not an Arab or a youth anymore. And I wouldn't have taken some of those jobs either, but I would take them today. So we shouldn't penalize young people for not doing something that we haven't thought through what we offered them. So the potential is there. Habib is an Arab
and he's relatively young. I want your opinion on that.
I mean, I agree with you and I disagree. I disagree because they have structures that don't allow for failures. If you go bankrupt, if a check bounces back, you go to jail. So if structurally you're not allowed to fail, then culturally you'll be living and growing up to believe that failure is a shame. Yes. And I have a saying, behind every great man there's a woman, but I would say it in the entrepreneurship world, behind every great Arab entrepreneur, there's a great Arab mom who thinks her son or her daughter is crazy to have left their jobs. So just to put it into perspective, that's not just about the entrepreneur themselves when they take risks, it's about the culture, it's about the mothers, the wives, the husbands. And here we need to bring more attention to it, but also it's about the education. And structurally speaking, we need to bring policies that allow for failure. Because if we can't fail, if you go on a blacklist of a government, of a bank because you failed, or if you go to jail because you failed, then you would never want to fail.
I want your closing remarks. If we want to say just one thing that will reduce youth unemployment, what would you say, Mr. Masood? In less than 1 minute.
It's time now to pick the examples of things that are working across the region and to scale them up and put our energy and efforts behind scaling up successes to a level that we need.
Dr. Erik.
Well, we have spoken a lot about SMEs, small and medium-sized companies. In fact, they are very important, of course, for creating jobs, but actually, most jobs are created in large companies. So we need to create an environment that allows both to prosper and to create a business environment that allows new companies to enter, old companies to exit.
Dr. Mustafa.
The one thing I would really emphasize at this stage, at this point in time, is that that in the Arab countries in transition at least, try to avoid to replicate the old private sector with the new rulers. That's the risk that we run. We need to take the old system and then replicate it again, and then we are going to go for another round. Just make sure that we really have a deep, true transformation of the private sector that is competitive, that is creative of wealth, of innovation, that is open to all, including the youth, and avoid the attraction of politicians to use the private sector as they used to do. That the new politicians, the new rulers, play the same games of the old system.
Mr. Curt, your closing remarks, please.
I would say use the innate strengths and skills that you can find in Arab society. For example, when we initiate these alternative education classes in communities, women are the key researchers we give them the skill set and they practice it. So they come back with the information that makes that school successful. That same information could find out if soap was a good product. It could be used for business purposes, but you have to have a business that accepts that women can do this at this level, and then you can upgrade. So go for the strengths and capacities that are already in society.
Habib, I will end with you.
I think the Arab world is passing through a major startup cycle, which is, first, it's uninformed optimism. We don't know what we're going through, like the Arab Spring. We think we're going to rule the world. We get to the top, then we go down. And it's informed pessimism. Now we're at the bottom. Now we want to go up, to go to the informed optimism. Entrepreneurship is one of those tools. Not only does it create jobs, it presents itself as a psychological tool for the young entrepreneurs to take it, and it's really a tool for optimism and for hope. So entrepreneurship at scale.
Thank you very much. Our time is up. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your participation. You can watch again this debate on our English website. Thank you very much.